So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Campanelli. Let me turn down my volume because I'm getting some feedback here. Hang on. So, I've been a litigation attorney for 30 years. I handle cell tower cases across the entire United States, and people come to me for everything from preventing the simple, irresponsible placement of a wireless facility to assisting their local government and making them aware of the fact that they have far more power to control the placement of wireless facilities than they've been led to believe. Contrary to what most people are being told by the wireless industry, when Congress adopted the Telecommunications Act in 1996, it considered giving the FCC the power to control where wireless facilities went. At the end of the day, they pretty much did the opposite. They adopted the first meaningful provision, which is paragraph C7A and is entitled General Authority. And in that provision, Congress explicitly preserved to state and local governments the general authority to regulate the siting, placement, construction, and maintenance of wireless facilities. The biggest obstacles to local governments exercising the powers preserved to them by Congress to control how many wireless facilities go in their jurisdiction and where they go is, number one, they have no idea that they have the power available to them. Number two, they don't adopt proper code provisions to take hold of that power. And equally, number three, they don't adopt code provisions which enable them to use the power in a way that doesn't violate several procedural requirements imposed upon them by the Telecommunications Act. Making things worse is the fact that most local municipal attorneys that try to advise their clients, the municipalities, basically have no idea what they're doing. It's really appalling. Sometimes I see memorandums prepared by a local municipal council where they say, oh, your hands by the Telecommunications Act. Nothing could be further from the truth. So in 1996, when the act was adopted and powers were vested in local governments, sophisticated local governments have used their powers to achieve three objectives through the enactment of smart planning provisions. Essentially, they dropped zoning code provisions, which enable carriers to saturate jurisdictions with wireless coverage. Everyone loves their smartphone, everyone loves their iPad, and so cell towers are a necessary evil, at least given the current state of technology. But just like a sewage treatment plant, just because it's necessary doesn't mean you put it right next to somebody's house. So when a smart planning provision is adopted and enforced, they have three objectives. Number one, allow the carriers to saturate the areas with coverage, while number two, minimizing the number of facilities you need to provide that coverage, and number three, avoid to the greatest extent possible any unnecessary adverse impacts upon individual homes and properties in residential neighborhoods. The reality is, if local governments adopt smart planning provisions, they have tremendous power to control where these things go. The problem is they're not doing that. And again, usually because they have no idea what they're doing. So local governments have been hiring me across the country, and I've been drafting ordinances, giving them the power to do that. Now, in the realm of 5G, the biggest problem is they're rolling out this 5G infrastructure in the form of hundreds of thousands of facilities. And the entities carrying out the majority of the rollout are not the carriers. It's not Verizon or T-Mobile or Sprint or AT&T. It is the site development companies. These are companies that don't actually provide personal wireless services. They build and own wireless infrastructure, and they lease space or capacity on that infrastructure to the carriers. Some of these individuals can be some of the most unscrupulous individuals you've ever met in your life. They don't have a problem putting these things on people's front lawns, 8 feet from someone's bedroom window, right in front of their front door. And the problem is, if your local government hasn't been well informed, they're powerless to stop it. Because without a properly drafted zoning code provision, site developers will walk in and just roll over you and ram wireless facilities down your throat anywhere they want to put them. They will threaten local governments. They will mislead local governments. They will deceive them. And sometimes I've seen them deceive a local government planning board, for example, and then they'll walk out and laugh at how gullible the local planning board was. And again, the only way to counter this is to draft good local zoning provisions. And include in those provisions, for example, procedural guidance for your planning board. Typically in a local government, they'll say, okay, you want to build a 150-foot cell tower, you have to get a permit. It might be a use permit, special use permit, conditional use permit. They might also need a site plan approval or a variance. And they'll say the application has to be brought to a public hearing, the public supposedly gets notice, and then the planning board has to make a decision. The problem is planning boards routinely violate the Telecommunications Act, and specifically the procedural requirements of the Telecommunications Act. And the reason they violate the Telecommunications Act is because you can't expect your planning board to comply with procedural requirements when they have no idea what they are. And most local zoning codes don't give them the guidance. So when I draft local zoning codes, I put procedural guidance for the planning boards, planning commissions, ZBAs, and so on and so forth. So that's the majority of it. Making things worse, the FCC is only too eager to help the site developers roll over local governments as much as they want to. They recently came out to a new interpretive order to reinterpret what's called an effective prohibition under the Telecommunications Act. And basically what that means is the Telecommunications Act has a provision that says local governments cannot prohibit or effectively prohibit the provision of personal wireless services. Back around 1998, most of the United States Circuit Courts of Appeals came up for a standard for what constitutes an effective prohibition. And the wireless companies didn't like that. So they went to the FCC to get help, and they got the FCC to issue an interpretive order, reinterpreting the language of the Telecommunications Act, despite the fact that the language never changed since 1996. And a site developer then took that order and rushed around to federal courts and said, ha, see, we have this new interpretation and this is binding on the courts. The Ninth Circuit got one of these cases called City of Portland and kind of punted on the issue. But in the Second Circuit in New York, a federal court said, and I quote, "It's not up to the FCC to put words in the Telecommunications Act that aren't there." And so federal courts have said, we're not bound by the FCC's new interpretive order. We're bound by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. In a recent case called Extenet versus the Village of Flower Hill, great case on pointing out how much power local governments have to control the placement of wireless facilities. So the key is to get your local government to adopt an ordinance which gives them the maximum power to control the placement and number of wireless facilities in your jurisdiction to the maximum extent intended by Congress. The only other thing you got to worry about is them listening to local counsel, which has no idea what they're doing, and it's not entirely their fault, and I can explain why, or the wireless companies going to your state legislature, which is even worse, and adopting a hoodwink law. Hoodwink laws are deceptive state laws, which look relatively innocuous on their face, but they're drafted in a completely deceptive manner. And the wireless companies deceive state legislatures into stripping more zoning powers away from local governments than the state legislature actually intended. Unfortunately, your state representatives get hoodwinked. They get tricked into adopting laws when they don't even understand what they mean. And that's the next biggest problem we're dealing with in the realm of wireless facilities. So with that, I'd really like to open this up to questions and get questions from the audience about anything you might want to know. I've handled more cell tower cases than I really want to remember. So there's a good chance if you have a decent question, I might be able to answer it. So with that, Gary, can we open up to questions?
Hi, Andrew. This is Valerie Marsh. I'm going to go ahead and moderate the afternoon session. Thank you so much.
Great.
I need to tell you that Mr. Campanelli is the only attorney I tell people to go to if they are serious about getting rid of cell towers. So it's amazing that we have him. Can we have any questions? Come on up.
Hello, my name is Andrew, and I'm so thankful that you're part of this presentation. I really respect just your expertise and your opinion. Are you familiar with Arizona's Wireless in the Right-of-Way Act that was signed by Governor Ducey a few years ago?
Yep, I am. And it's not the worst hoodwink law, but it's pretty bad.
That's what I was afraid of.
The first question I ask constituents, and I will tell you, every time I find a case where somebody installed a cell tower in somebody's front lawn, it's because of a law like Arizona's. The first question you should be asking your state legislature is, why would you adopt a law to take zoning powers away from local governments to prevent the irresponsible placement of wireless facilities? It serves no purpose whatsoever. So in Arizona's law, if I recall correctly, one of the things it does is it provides that local governments can't ask for information about an applicant's coverage or its ability to provide services to its customers. This is insidious language. There is no benefit to be derived by the state of Arizona or any citizen of Arizona by the state legislature taking that power away from local governments. However, it is a silver bullet to powers of local governments to control the placement of wireless facilities. And here's why. It's really insidious language. Two of the constraints which the Telecommunications Act of 1996 imposes upon local governments are, number one, any denial of an application for a wireless facility must be based upon substantial evidence. The second is that local governments may not prohibit or effectively prohibit the provision of personal wireless services. Now, what does that mean? At least up until recently, it means if somebody wants to put a 150-foot cell tower on Mary Smith's front lawn, and they want to claim that denying the application would violate federal law, they have to prove that an identified carrier has a significant gap in its personal wireless services, and number two, that its proposed installation at the specific site they want it, at the specific height they want it, is the least intrusive means of remedying that gap. Now, if they go before your planning board to get a special use permit to build a 150-foot tower on Mary Smith's front door, and they provide computer-generated propagation maps, which are garbage, by the way, they have no probative value, but they provide some evidence of a gap and that potential alternative, less intrusive locations would remedy the gap. Now the planning board needs evidence to rebut that, because without evidence to rebut that, they can't deny the application because they don't have substantial evidence to support the denial. What the Arizona law does is it strips the local government of the authority to simply ask for the evidence, without which federal law precludes the local government from denying the application, no matter how bad it is. Now, why would your state legislature do that unless they had no idea of how the law actually works? It's disgusting. That law should never have been adopted, and it's not the worst one. There are other laws in other states that are even worse. But every citizen of Arizona should get up and scream and yell and tell them to repeal that law immediately, because if you don't, I am seeing wireless facilities getting installed in people's backyards, on their front lawns, 8 feet from bedroom windows, all without the homeowner's permission, and they just ram it down your throat. So I'm very familiar with the Arizona law.
Thank you. I'm just going to take what you just said and put it in a little bit smaller words because what you said is so key. What Mr. Campanelli is saying is that in order to put up a tower, they have to show that there's a gap in service. But the thing is, there never is, maybe with a rare exception. So I mentioned a website earlier called Wire America, W-I-R-E America. If you go there, you're going to find instructions on how to prove that there's no gap in service, and it is so simple and it's fun. Two people go out, one of them has a little iPhone to take a video, the other one says, hey, see my phone? I'm at this address, take a little picture, I have 5 bars. Let's go to the next area. This is amazing, and this is the evidence, and Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the evidence you can take to your city and say, see, there is no gap, tower bye-bye, or is that a little simplification?
Well, the problem is, and I used to have people do call logs. So they would say, look, we have no service on Smith Street. The problem is, if you do testing like that, federal courts are starting to reject it, saying it's anecdotal, it's not conclusive. And that's why smart local governments require the applicant to provide the hard data. If they want to claim they have a significant gap in service, what they're supposed to do is, number one, tell you what signal strength they need to have reliable service. So if you're in a flat terrain, they can say, okay, we need a minimum signal strength of minus 98 dBm to have reliable service. Then they take a recording device attached to a phone and drive through the area. That recording device will record every few milliseconds. And so on a 1-hour drive, they'll have 150,000 records, not a few. Those records, if they give you the hard data, they will show you the existence of actual gaps, the location of the gaps, and the boundary of the gaps. Then and only then can a local government determine if the site where they want to put the tower makes any sense at all. Because if there are gaps and the tower doesn't cover them, they're going to want to put up more towers. So these are the problems. Again, and if your local code doesn't say your board can ask for that data, some federal courts say you can't ask for it. Your board can't ask for it unless the code says they can ask for it. That's why the code is critical.
Does our code currently, you're saying, preclude our government from asking for that data, or can we do that process?
Well, the Arizona code, if I recall correctly, has limitations on what the local governments can ask for. It does say you can ask for propagation maps. The problem with propagation maps is they have no validity. They're generated using software, and they can be easily manipulated. In fact, back in 2020, the staff at the FCC told the FCC that they should not accept propagation maps from wireless companies without actual drive test data, because they got so sick of looking at what they knew were bogus maps that the FCC staff went out and did 10,000 miles of drive testing. And they found that the maps being submitted by the wireless industry ranged in accuracy from 62% down to about 26%, and said, you can't rely on these maps. So just like the FCC doesn't want to release maps, and the California Public Utilities Commission doesn't want to rely on these maps, local governments in Arizona shouldn't rely upon them either.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, thanks. My name's Jen, and I just wanted to share that we have a cell phone tower within probably 200 feet of our house, and it's literally in our neighbor's front yard. I mean, kids are there. They just, it's a big one. It's not like a little cell phone tower. And so what I'm wondering, maybe it's been installed for a while. We're in a pretty rural area. But I don't know, how would that go about them taking it down or moving it, or what would be the situation with something like that? I'm renting as well, so it's different.
I don't blame you.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to live within. I wouldn't want to live within 1,500 feet of one of these things, knowing what I know. It's always much harder to get them taken down after they're built. Much more difficult. You may want to speak to an attorney admitted in your state, and please understand, I am not admitted to the state of Arizona. I think I just handled a case in Arizona 2 days ago. I got pro vice admission to the state to handle a zoning case on a cell tower. So I think I had 2 in Arizona. But you may want to speak to a local attorney about possibly finding out if you have a cause of action for nuisance under your state law. There have been some successful cases across the country where a cell tower is so irresponsibly placed that you could claim it violates nuisance because of the significant adverse aesthetic impact it imposes upon your house, or even perhaps of reduction in property values, or perhaps if your property is in the fault zone of the tower. That's a whole nother ball of wax.
I have another
So you need to
question.
speak to an attorney admitted in your state about whether or not you may or may not be able to bring a cause of action for nuisance.
The other,
I would also, I'm assuming your house is at a 2-story home. If it is, you should get an RF meter or even an RF engineer and just test the radiation level in your home. We can't talk about potential health concerns in local zoning board hearings to the extent that the applicant provides proof that the facility will be FCC compliant. My biggest pet peeve is that once a tower goes up, the FCC never tests the radiation emanating from the tower, nor does it require the owners to test it. So here we have emissions limits on cars, and they have to get tested once a year. But cell towers that emit radiation, they don't have to get tested. And the wireless industry knows it.
one more thing is that the people that have the cell phone tower in their front yard apparently are being paid. And I was curious about the legality of that.
They enter a lease, and the lease will be 5 years with 9 5-year options. Wow. So it's a 45-year lease. Wow. And they're always one-sided. The neighbors, once they sign that lease, they can never get out of it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I just had a question about I'm electrosensitive, and I've read that that's actually one of the disabilities in the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I don't know, in your experience, if you've ever seen anybody successfully use that to force an employer or a cell phone company or my neighbor who wants to put, a neighborhood small cell on top of their house. It will obviously impact me. Do I have any recourse through ADA?
That's an excellent question. In fact, I just lost a case about 5 days ago before the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. I get calls constantly from people telling me they're getting ill from exposure to RF radiation. There's no question in my mind that there is a segment of the population which is EMS sensitive. That means people who suffer adverse health symptoms when they're exposed to radiation levels, which wouldn't affect the average person. And in my view, that makes them disabled with the meaning of the ADA. And so I brought a federal lawsuit in the Northern District of California. You can look up the case. It's Wolf versus the city of Millbrae. A carrier installed transmitters in very close proximity to a gentleman's bedroom. He owned a co-op on the top floor of his building. He got very sick. He went to his doctor, and his doctor told him he has the classic signs of overexposure to microwave radiation. And so he moved out and he filed a federal lawsuit against the city and the carrier, claiming that he is disabled in the meaning of the ADA, and thus he's entitled to a reasonable accommodation. Now, what would a reasonable accommodation be? In theory, it would be anything that would allow him to live in his home without suffering adverse symptoms. So either you could move the facility a farther distance away or perhaps reduce the power. But in any event, you've got to reduce the level of radiation inside his home. The district court dismissed the case. I filed an appeal. It went up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said, well, we're not going to put the town to a Hobson's choice. We're not going to give them a decision to either violate the TCA or the ADA, so the case is dismissed. I think, quite frankly, it's a horrible decision. I am looking for a case to file in the First or the Second Circuit where the federal judges are more sympathetic to disabled people. I think I'll get the opposite result. And I think ultimately the decision will go up to the US Supreme Court, because once you get opposing decisions on the same law from two different circuits, it increases the likelihood that the Supreme Court will grant cert. And I think this case needs to be decided, because I believe, as you do, that people who are EMS sensitive are disabled with the meaning of the ADA, and they're protected under federal law. And they shouldn't be forced to be subjected to harmful levels of radiation in the confines of their own home, especially their own bedroom. So I feel strongly about this issue, and I'm looking to litigate it further.
God bless you.
Hi there, Andrew. This is Russell Whitty. So I want to just share a little bit our experience in Tucson, Arizona. As you may know, the city council and mayor have an open invitation since May of 2021 for a free consultation with you, and they have not even responded to those requests. In some cases, 100 people writing letters for that, and we continue to ask for that. So let's just look at where we are now in Tucson. So we have over 500 5G cell towers in front of houses and businesses, in some cases a few feet from houses all over the city. It seems like we've done almost everything right. We certainly got up to speed quickly. I got into this in 2019 when I started. I mean, my background, professor at the university and working with microwaves, so it was very obvious to me that there needs to be some oversight on this. And immediately the local city council members would say, our hands are tied, go talk to the federal government, there's nothing we can do. So I had to get up to speed. So in June 2020, with the help of Susan Clark and other people, we wrote a 13-page letter to the city council and mayor and the city demanding a moratorium, that we need to look at the local ordinance. Of course, at that time, it was a state of emergency, so we thought we had justification. And again, no response to follow-up letters. We haven't still, I don't believe, had a public hearing whatsoever as of today. I don't think that's happened since I've been involved. And then you throw in the fact that they, in a closed session, or I guess in February 21st, 2021, they voted unanimously to amend their local wireless ordinance, acknowledging some problems. They still have not done that. Instead, what they did was publish a utility manual that didn't, they kind of try to get around any public input in that, which isn't even wireless. It's got electrical, Tucson Electric Power, there's other water, other things, right? So we resorted to turning into notices and affidavits because we couldn't even sit down and meet with these people and have a conversation. And so we have served 1,500 legal notices, as well as 400 notarized affidavits and counting, documenting all the things that they've done wrong. And we haven't been able to stop this massive deployment. So here we are in Tucson trying to figure out what we do with a population that for the most part really doesn't have any idea that this has happened, that they actually have power and things they can do. So given looking back now and where we are now, do you have any advice?
Well, first of all, I will tell you that as I go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction drafting wireless ordinances for them from scratch, I would say 65% of times I'm hired by the local government themselves. However, in 40% of the cases, it's actually the residents who get together and hire me and pay me, and I draft an ordinance from scratch to vest the government with the local maximum power they can have. And then they present it to the local government and say, here it is, it's done for you, just adopt it. Why would you not want to possess more power to control the placement of wireless facilities? And these ordinances have been adopted in places like Dalton Gardens, Idaho, Washington, Ithaca, New York, all over the country. Again, the problem is they're getting advice from their local attorneys, very often who, in my view, are committing malpractice because they don't know what they're talking about. And here's what's happening. I understand why they're so wrong. So you can get a general municipal attorney with a lot of experience who's very smart, and they say, well, let me do the research. Let me see what local governments can and can't do under the Telecommunications Act. And when they do research, what that means is they go on to the most commonly used research tools, which are Westlaw and Lexis. These databases, so database services, enable you to search cases. And what they go on there and they find is, well, here are all these cases where local governments got sued because they denied a cell tower application, and they lose 75% of the time. So it looks like if you turn down a tower, you're going to get sued and lose 75% of the time. What they're absolutely clueless to is that they're looking at the wrong universe of cases. Here's why. Out of 100 cases that get filed for cell towers, let's say in 85% of the cases, they go before a planning board, a planning commission, a city council, or a ZBA. If the planning board denies the application and they do it in a way that complies with the requirements of the Telecommunications Act, it's over. The town, county, or city exercised their authority, denied an application, and thereby prevented the irresponsible placement of a wireless facility. In 10 or 15% of the cases, when they did so, they failed to comply with all of the requirements of the Telecommunications Act because their local attorney didn't properly advise them. In those cases, the site development company knows they violated the Telecommunications Act, so they will then bring a lawsuit. So they really only bring lawsuits when they know they're going to win because the act was violated. So they win 70% of the time. So what the municipal attorney who does the research doesn't understand, they only win 70% of the cases where the local government actually violated the Telecommunications Act. But in the 85% of the cases where they exercise their power and they didn't get sued, you can't find them in Lexis or Westlaw. So they actually reach the contrary conclusion to what's actually true. And they read only those cases, and they go back to the local government and say, oh my God, your hands are tied, there's nothing you can do. And they have absolutely no clue what they're talking about. In addition, the Telecommunications Act, federal courts constantly say it's not a model of clarity. The Telecommunications Act imposes procedural requirements on local governments, but doesn't say what they are. So unless you actually work with these cases, you have no idea what you're looking at, just look at the code. And for these two reasons, when a local municipal attorney does 6 hours worth of research, they prepare a memorandum that says, your hands are tied by the Telecommunications Act, local governments need to fire those attorneys because they have no idea what they're talking about. And that's the problem.
Yes, and they treat our city attorney as God. He's been there almost 20 years, and they respect him. They always
And
say
he may be
that.
brilliant.
Yeah,
he may
right.
be great at every other area of law he practices.
Yeah.
But if he's telling them their hands are tied, they need to get a new one.
I'm just going to hand this to the next person. I just wanted to add, I forgot one detail. We did draft our own ordinance, the Tucsonans Wireless Ordinance, in March 2021 and delivered it there. Could not even set up a meeting to discuss it with any of them, which is part of the problem. So thank you for your great advice.
Thank you.
Hi. I so appreciate your defending everyone on a local level and bringing this all local. And I'd like to instead, for a moment, take this upstream a bit. Is there any effort that you are aware of to curtail the FCC and the Telecommunications Act? Is there any effort? I mean, I could go to a number of places with that, including personal sovereignty being, violated on a constitutional basis even. But is there any effort, is there any hope to take it upstream so that these battles don't have to be fought so piecemeal across the country?
Well, I have to be a realist. The wireless industry has virtually unlimited funds, which translates to virtually unlimited lobbying and political power. Do I think we can get Congress to change the FCC, Congress to change the Telecommunications Act to somehow tip the balance of power further in favor of local governments? I don't see that happening. As far as the FCC, I tend to view the FCC as little more than, at this point, the handmaiden of the wireless industry. My sense is the wireless industry says to the FCC, jump, and they say how high. In the most recent interpretive order I mentioned earlier, I think it's 116 pages, single-spaced, and it reinterprets this provision of the Telecommunications Act. The FCC mentions the interest of a specific site development company 46 times, but it doesn't mention the interest of local towns or the balancing of interests or anything even remotely suggesting that they considered the interest of local government's ability to apply their zoning codes. Not once.
Does the state
So
have any
who does sound like
standing?
a servant?
Sorry.
I'm sorry?
Do the states have any standing to stand up to the, first off, the FCC and all those three-letter agencies aren't actually legal authorities under the Constitution. Only the legislature can do that. So this is apparent authority, but maybe not real authority. It's effective. They are doing that. But is there a way around that? And do the states have any standing to resist that? In my opinion, they do.
States are not standing up because, and the worst part is, just the opposite is happening.
Right.
The wireless industry is wielding its financial influence and getting states to adopt statutes which are far worse than the Telecommunications Act. The Arizona law is bad. It's not the worst, but it's bad. If you want to lobby your state legislature to repeal that law because it serves no benefit to the public. It only hurts the public. And the only two states that have really stood up to them so far are New York and California, thank God. But every day there are groups representing the wireless industry. They go up to the state legislatures, they throw around huge amounts of money, and all of a sudden these hoodwink laws come out. And they sound innocuous, and they look like they're only intended to apply to small wireless facility and public rights of way, and it's hogwash. I'll give you an example. Suppose they say this limited law, small wireless facility law only applies to public rights of way. And they'll couch it in terms of it's only on main roads and stuff. Well, when you look at the definition of public right of way, it includes roads, streets, sidewalks, areas adjacent to them, public utility easements. Well, I got news for you. Unless you're off grid, if you have electric run into your house, there is a public utility easement running across your property. The very first time I had a poor family find out that they had a 40-foot cell tower on their front lawn, the site developer claimed that they're a public utility. They had a right to put it on the public utility easement. So that's the kind of nonsense that I'm watching because of these hoodwink state laws. They're very deceptive, and it's a horror show. Any state that has one, all the constituents should just light up the switchboards at their state legislature and demand, don't ask, demand that they get rescinded.
Thank you. I like the idea of taking it a bit upstream, so thank you.
So, Andrew, in Arizona, are you referring to HB 2365 as the law that needs to be repealed, that people need to push for?
I think that's the one.
Yeah.
I read so many state statutes every day. Yeah. Ironically, I just read this one last week, and I'm pretty sure that's it.
Okay, so I just want to let people know that it is HB 2365. Russ just confirmed that. That can be repealed if enough of us rise up. And I don't know if you caught that before, but Mr. Campanelli he can't try a case here, but he can consult any lawyer who doesn't know as much as he does about these laws. So there's some hope, and you need to know that there's nobody who's taking that charge right now. And if you are from the Valley or know anybody from the Valley who could do that, that's a spot that can be filled, and that's a spot that would save our neck down there. So thanks. Next question.
So just one correction. I can handle litigation in Arizona. I just have to file something called a Prague Vici application. I file them every day.
Even better. Thank you.
Hi, Andrew. I'm Ann Friday of Prescott. I retained you in 2020. and you did a beautiful job of helping us both overcome HB 2365 and our local zoning board in defeating the 80-foot Yavapai Hills cell tower. They wanted to put 50 feet from those residents' backyards. And I just want to let the audience know that although you couldn't represent us, as you've stated, you directed us on what we needed to focus on to provide your office with, and your staff put together this excellent presentation for us to make based on the laws that were current at the time to our Prescott Planning and Zoning Commission. And we were joined in our testimony by Dr. Whitty, and also assisted along the way by Wire America, Paul G. and Susan Clark. And the Planning and Zoning Commission voted 5-2 to recommend denial of this tower after one of our members of Relocate the Cell Tower group presented it to them. Now, the Verizon engineer, as Paul G. exposed, was not even a certified engineer, although he had signed the application stating that. And all of his microwave radiation emissions information was for one antenna, not the 12 antennas they planned to put there. And when Paul G. presented that to our city council the night before they were to vote on whether to adopt the recommendation or not, the applicant, who's a prominent developer in Prescott, withdrew the application. So we were saved in that respect, although it could come back at any time. And after that, because I learned of your, what I believe is a very generous offer to these local governments to work with them, provide the free consultation, and then put together, based on the local ordinances and the state ordinances, a package to protect public safety and honor the laws. I sent that to the prior mayor, Mingarelli, and the prior city council, and got no response. And a few months afterward, we had a new election, and we have a new mayor now, Mayor Good, who was here just a few minutes ago, and a new city council. So I sent your package to them with the offer of the free consultation. And Mayor Good, if you're here, you might want to. So, thank you. I highly recommend your services.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And I'm really glad that you shared that story, because that's something that every city can do. So here you go, Ken.
Hello. I have a couple questions that I'm relaying from, I believe it's the live stream, and then I have a question as well. I guess I'll ask my question first. Can you give any advice for Arizona, say for residents who want to have their digital so-called smart meter or AMI meter, I think is the term, if I'm not mistaken, removed and replaced with an electromechanical analog meter? Because I found that that's very difficult, if not almost impossible to do. Do you have any advice on how to do that?
Yeah, for that type of issue, you have to really speak to an attorney who's admitted in the state of Arizona. Each state has their own requirements for opt-out provisions. So when they put something like this up, each state governs whether or not the provider must have an opt-out provision or not. I don't know if Arizona has an opt-out requirement.
I think they phased it out.
An attorney who's admitted in your state who can look up whether or not Arizona has an opt-out requirement for utility providers. If there's an opt-out requirement, they must allow you to opt out.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm going to read a question that we got from the live stream. It says, does Arizona House Bill 2365 prohibit a wireless telecommunication ordinance asking for a gap in coverage provision? And does Arizona HB 2365 prohibit towns from dictating a hierarchy of preferred locations for wireless sites?
I'd have to go back and look at it. I don't remember. But I don't recall any Arizona law, and it may be out there, preventing a hierarchy of sites. You may want to speak to an attorney admitted in your state who's more familiar with it than I am. My focus is really the federal law, but you'd really have to speak to an attorney who's admitted in your state.
Okay, thanks. And then one just final question that someone asked me to read. It says, what is the best way to get our local governments to work with you?
Well, I can't lobby you to hire me, but again, some groups have been so insistent that they actually group people together and get the money together and hire me to draft an ordinance, and then they present it to the local government and demand that they adopt it. I think in the city of Langley, Washington, I think somebody actually set up a GoFundMe site, and they raised the funds for my fee, and they paid it, and the city was thrilled. They presented the ordinance I drafted to the city of Langley, and the city adopted it. So it worked out well.
Great. Thank you so much.
Hi, this extends on that thought, and that was, what are we looking at? Well, okay, I had a couple questions. One was, we're looking at the HB 2365, which sounds like it ties our hands utterly, but I just heard a success story. So how is it that Arizonans work around this? Is that something you? And then you talked about you can drop these ordinances. What are we looking at? What is the cost and time period if a bunch of citizens get together and say, hey, let's go after this thing? And is anyone going after a national strategy of protecting health from this?
Okay, so there's I got to pull your questions apart. Yeah. So with respect to the first question, you have to understand that the grounds for denying an application for a wireless facility, whether it's a cell tower, small cell, distributed antenna system, the grounds for a denial come from your local zoning code. So putting aside the Telecommunications Act for a moment, if your code says you want to build a cell tower, you need a special use permit, they can deny the application based upon any of the traditional grounds upon which they deny other zoning applications for other types of facilities. So they can deny it based upon the grounds that it will inflict a significant adverse aesthetic impact on nearby homeowners, it'll reduce the value of nearby homes, it'll be inconsistent with the character of the neighborhood, it'll affect a historic ridge line, it has an insufficient fall zone, things like that. The only time you must get into evidence of significant gap or least intrusive means is when the applicant files the application and as part of the application alleges, number one, that an identified carrier has a significant gap in personal wireless services, which is why they want this tower built here, and that the proposed installation is the least intrusive means of remedying that gap. My recollection of the Arizona state law is, it says you can't ask them, and it's really poorly drafted language. It says things like you can't ask them about their customer satisfaction or the services of the customers or things like that, but you can ask for a propagation map and something else. I forget exactly what it says. So it does leave the door open only because the language was so inartfully drafted. It was a poor attempt to strip local governments of power. So you can use to your advantage the inartful drafting to at least require some evidence of the need. Because again, if the applicant claims significant gap, least intrusive means, then the board must determine whether or not the applicant has proven both of those things. Here's why. Let's say they want to put a cell tower in Mary Smith's front lawn, and the board says, you're going to destroy the value of her house. And based upon that, we're going to deny the application. But the board doesn't address the fact that the applicant is claiming significant gap and least intrusive means. And so they make no factual determination on that. The minute they issue the decision, within 30 days, the applicant will file a federal lawsuit and win and get an order from a judge ordering the municipality to grant them the permits so they can build a facility. Because the board did not make a factual determination it was required to make. Now, the good news is federal judges hate zoning cases, hate Telecommunications Act cases. They don't want to be zoning boards of appeals. So your board as long as it makes the factual determinations it's required to make, federal judges are loath to overturn those factual determinations as long as there's more than a shred of evidence in the record to support them. The problem is most local codes don't instruct their boards to make those determinations. And if they forget to make them, you lose. It doesn't matter how bad the place of the tower is going to be, you're going to lose because the board didn't understand what it needed to do to make its decision immune from federal court challenge. You lose only because your code stinks.
Thank you.
Anybody still awake?
Yes, we've only got 37 seconds. So I think we need to wrap up. Thank you so much. And what you just said about this oversight that can cost a case, just another reason to reach out to Mr. Campanelli to advise attorneys here.
Oh, second part of your question, what does it cost? $8,500, that's it.
Great. All right. I love the GoFundMe idea. Thank you so much, Mr. Campanelli. This was
It was a
amazing.
pleasure. Nice speaking to all of you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.